Okay, everybody, welcome back. It's good to see you again. The room is a little bit more full than it's been for a while. We have a lot of people back from isolation and quarantine, which is great news. And the weather's pretty yucky. And so just kind of checking in, make sure we're all doing okay. This is the part of the semester where things start to get kind of intense. Midterms, projects, things like that start to be due. And then we're in the middle of an election season, which is particularly contentious, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. So we have a lot going on, and now it's snowing, right? So you might be feeling a little rough. So this is from Grease, and this is from Pulp Fiction, two different movies in which John Travolta both starred. In case you're not familiar with those. So just a couple of reminders just are people who specialize in wellness and self-care, right? So now it's more important than ever that you support your body as well as you can. So in times of stress and difficulty, you want to be at your peak performance. And so for your body, you want to eat well, eat regularly, eat lots of different food groups, try to eat nutritious foods, try to avoid things that are not so healthy for you, which the one you mostly get into is alcohol in your age group. Move your body. So the benefits of any type of exercise or physical movement cannot be understated as long as you don't overdo. And getting outside, although this afternoon might not be your best bet, right, has really huge beneficial effects in terms of alleviating stress. The Japanese call it forest bathing. So actually kind of going out and spending time in nature is really important. And you may not realize it, but people in your age group generally, and especially if they're doing a lot of physical or athletic activity or a lot of cognitive activity, need about 8 to 10 hours of sleep every night in order to function optimally. In fact, they did a study where they took a whole bunch of college students and they randomized them, right? So they randomly assigned a bunch of them to one group and then another group. And in the first group, they had them sleep 8 to 10 hours a night every night. And in the second group, they said, you're only going to sleep 6 hours a night. And then after 2 weeks of this, they gave them some cognitive tests to do. And the 6 hour per night students performed as poorly on the test as if they had a 0.8 blood alcohol level. So getting enough sleep is really important for your brain to function optimally, both cognitively and emotionally. So do what you can to try to make sure that that's a priority. Part of all the stresses that we're under right now, because there are a lot of things that are totally not within our control, right? So a lot of external forces. So it's really important to take agency where you can, right? So control those things that you can. So what you can control is how you spend your time to a certain extent, right? Maybe you have a job, you have to go to class, all those types of things. But you can choose what you spend your time and attention on. So sometimes kind of taking a moment to think about what's important to you, maybe getting good grades is important, right? Maybe doing well in your classes is important. Maybe maintaining your relationships with some of your friends or your family, maybe that's important. I think sometimes when we talk about self-care, we tend to sometimes conflate that or confuse that with self-indulgence, right? So binge watching Sabrina on Netflix might feel really fun at the moment, but spending 3 hours doing that is not necessarily going to set you up well for what you need to do. So just a few reminders, the little mom in me coming out and the doctor in me, okay? All right, so that's also a preface to the fact that our midterm is next Thursday. So next week is a wonky week. Tuesday is advisement day. We don't have class next week because it's advisement day. So if you're a freshman, that's new to you. The exam on Thursday will be here in this room during our normal class time. So bring your laptops. It's going to be on Canvas. And it's going to be a lot like your regular weekly quizzes, the difference being that it's not open book, right? And that it's everything that we've learned thus far. Question types will be similar to the same types of questions you've been seeing. They won't be the same exact questions, however. Okay? Questions? All right, Remember, we have a tutor for this class. I'm available every Thursday afternoon to hang out in the Blackboard course room. Nobody come visits me. So come visit me, right? All right. Lastly, we're coming up on an election, so if you haven't already figured out how you're going to vote, please visit. UW Stout has a whole information page for you to tell you about everything that you want to do in order to make sure that your voice can be heard. You can vote as a resident of your hometown, or you can choose instead to register and vote as a resident of Menominee because you live here enough of the time, unless you're a commuter. So if you actually live in Menominee, you can register to vote in Menominee. So all that information is here, everything that you need to know. All right, any questions? All right, I'm going to give you a COVID update because there's some interesting things happening. This is United States data. These are new cases per day. So in the summer, we saw a big bump in cases. This was primarily driven by outbreaks in the south. So we saw a lot in Texas and Arizona and a couple of other countries or states, excuse me, had some significant outbreaks over the summer. And then things seemed to get under control, and now we're headed back up again, and that's now primarily being driven by increasing numbers in the upper Midwest. So Wisconsin and North and South Dakota are kind of vying for the top 3 spots right now in terms of new COVID cases. This is what Wisconsin looks like right now. So it's pretty ugly, actually, in terms of the numbers of new cases we're seeing per day. We're breaking records regularly. And because of that, we're also seeing increases in our deaths. So these are daily new deaths, right? Not a lot per day, relatively speaking, right? But our average is certainly going up, and it's now higher than it was back in May. And some of you may know there was a high school English teacher who just retired from Chippewa High School after last year, who just passed away this week. And he was much beloved. He was 55. He had no underlying health conditions, right? That's what we want to avoid. So how are we doing in Dunn County? We're actually doing quite well this past week. So these are Monday to Monday data numbers. So this was last week. We had 99 total cases, 56 in people aged 10 to 29 and 41 in people aged 30 to 69. And you can see in the week that ended this past Monday, we were quite a lot better at 70, and huge kudos to your age group, dropped to less than half, right? This is wonderful news. What isn't wonderful news is the people in my age group, right? So we're still seeing a lot of COVID in the older folks, ages 30 to 69. And of course, we worry about that because these are the people that are increased risk for hospitalization and or death. So in your age group, you know, maybe about a 1% chance that you'll end up needing to be in the hospital. This is Wisconsin data. My age group, about 4 to 5%, right? And it goes up significantly thereafter. So these are our hospitalizations, new hospitalizations per week. This is the week ending on Monday. So we've never had that many people admitted to the hospital ever in our county. So this is very concerning. Hospitals are more full than they have been since the pandemic started. And my friend is still in the hospital, and she's still spiking fevers, and she's still really sick. As far as I know, she's not on a ventilator, but I haven't heard from her yet today. This is what we want to avoid. So overall, the United States isn't doing great, and Wisconsin certainly isn't doing great, but Dunn County, especially in your age group, is doing really well. So again, thank you for wearing your masks. Please continue to do so. It is much, much appreciated, right? You guys are doing awesome in terms of keeping infection rates low in your age cohort. Any questions about this? Yeah, Damon.
So the infection means that they won't be testing for 90 days after testing positive. Why is that?
Yeah, so if you get COVID, right, if you end up testing positive, the recommendation is that you don't get retested for 90 days. Also that you won't have to quarantine if, you know, a couple weeks later you come into contact with somebody who tests positive for COVID. The reason for that is we have really good data that shows that after having, confirmed COVID infection, we haven't seen any cases of anybody getting reinfected within 90 days. So you seem to get some immunity. Now, there have been some people who have been reinfected beyond that time period. Not many, which is encouraging, but it's still early, so it's hard to know. But within that 3 months, we feel very confident that you can't get it again, right? So for that reason, we don't want to test you because it's practically impossible. The other reason why we don't want to test you again, so if you live in the dorms, once you've tested positive, they're not going to test you again for 3 months, is because the test sometimes can stay positive for up to 90 days after an infection. Because they're just looking for those little antigens, they're looking for those little pieces of RNA, and so sometimes the test will stay positive even though the infection has been cleared, because it's just picking up little bits of broken up virus. Good question. Other questions? All right. Let's talk about pee. All right. So moving into the urinary system. So last week we did digestive system, right? So we talked about the ways that we get nutrients into our body, right, by absorbing them from the lumen or the inside of our intestines. And in order to absorb them, first we have to break them down. Breaking those molecules down into smaller pieces is called digestion. We have mechanical and chemical. All right, so we bring those nutrients in so that A, we can use glucose for cellular respiration to make ATP in the mitochondria, and B, because those molecules are going to be the building blocks for making proteins or carbohydrates or lipids or other things that we need structurally for our body. So as a result of all the chemical reactions that are constantly happening in our bodies, waste products get generated. We've already talked about the waste product that gets generated from cellular respiration in the mitochondria. The major waste product is not urine. So remember, cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria. It's the process by which we make ATP inside all of our cells. There's 2 ingredients that have to go in. What are they? What are the 2 things that your cell needs in order to make ATP? So the waste product is going to be carbon dioxide. So the ingredients are glucose and oxygen. All right, we're going to take glucose and oxygen. We're going to do cellular respiration. That's going to produce ATP, and it's going to generate carbon dioxide as a waste product. Luckily, we can exhale carbon dioxide. So that waste product is taken care of through the respiratory system. But other chemical processes that our bodies are constantly doing, building up proteins, digesting things, all kinds of reactions that are happening, can also generate other types of waste products that we cannot simply exhale. So we need another way to get rid of those. All right, and so that's one of the functions that the urinary system is going to do for us. So the nice thing about the urinary system is there's not that many anatomical parts. Okay, so we have 2 kidneys, 1 on each side. They receive blood coming from the aorta, the main artery of the body, through the renal arteries. And then that blood is oxygen-rich and glucose-rich, right, to supply the kidneys so they can do their cellular respiration inside all the little kidney cells. And then that used-up blood that's high in carbon dioxide will move out through the renal veins and into the inferior vena cava and up to the heart. The kidneys are located kind of back here, right? So that's why you can't punch somebody here with boxing. That's a kidney punch. That's like, I don't know, it's against the rules. I don't know what they call it, right? So the kidneys, in order to get waste out of our bloodstream, they're going to take those wastes and put them into urine. That urine is going to drain down through these tubes, 1 on each side, called ureters, into the bladder. And then when the bladder gets sufficiently full, we will empty it, and the urine will leave our body through the urethra. So let's talk about Kathy. Kathy wants to donate a kidney to her sister who needs one. So as part of the testing to get her all set and ready, they happened to do a CAT scan, which is what this is, and they found that actually she has only 1 kidney. So let me show you what we're looking at here because it's really kind of cool to see. So a CAT scan or a CT scan is a way to use x-rays and computer software to reconstruct a three-dimensional model of the inside of somebody's body. And then we look at it in slices. So this right now here is if we sliced her body this way. So this is her right side, this is her left side. This big thing up here, that's the liver. This is the aorta, and here is a kidney on the left side. There's no kidney on the right side. This stuff over here is just some intestines. Okay? So that's kind of weird to only have one kidney. In fact, it happens in about 1 in every 250 people, right? But so usually we have two. These are the same things that I kind of just described to you earlier. But I just want to point out that the word renal, R-E-N-A-L, means of the kidney. So the artery to the kidney is the renal artery. The vein that brings blood away from the kidney is the renal vein. All right. Within the kidney, there are 3 different regions. The outermost rind kind of like of the kidney is called the cortex. I've never liked that word because it seems like, core should be the inner part, but no, in anatomy, the cortex is the outer rind. So this whole region here is called the cortex. And there's some really interesting structures located there that we'll get into a little bit today. Then we have a middle area here called the medulla that has these little, they almost look like candy corns. They're called the renal pyramids. And then the innermost area is the pelvis, okay? So this area here is called the pelvis, and this is where the urine is going to collect before it then moves down the ureter. So if you cut open a kidney, this is what it looks like on the inside. It's really pretty cool looking. All right. So the function of the kidneys that we're going to talk about today is to filter this blood that's coming in and pull wastes out of it and make those into urine. So that's an excretory function. So about 1 in 500 people only have one kidney, like Kathy. And interestingly, most people can live pretty well with just one kidney. You can get by, just like you can get by sometimes with half a liver, like my friend who donated half of her liver to her daughter who needed a liver transplant, right? So it's pretty cool that humans are built with a little extra redundancy, a little extra capacity, as long as we take good care of our bodies. If you have diabetes or high blood pressure or high cholesterol or other things that contribute to atherosclerosis, which can also be very hard on the kidneys, then one kidney might not be enough for you because your kidneys are going to have a tough time. But a lot of people can get by just fine with just one, which is why sometimes you can donate one, right? Okay, it's pretty cool. All right, moving down, let's talk about Peter. He has this terrible pain, and it seizes up, and it's really sharp, and it's really awful, and then it goes away. And then it seizes up, and it feels like he's getting stabbed inside in the back here. It's 10 out of 10 pain. He comes into the emergency room, and he's just a mess. He's just in tears. He's groaning. He's terribly uncomfortable. And so it turns out he has a kidney stone stuck in his ureter. So let's take a look at that. So those ureters, right, are these paired tubes, one on each side. And as you'll see, they're relatively narrow. They are narrower than the renal pelvis. So you can imagine that if you have a little stone that forms up here and it starts to go down, it could easily get stuck. Now the ureters are really interesting because it's not just a plain tube. They actually have smooth muscle in their walls and will peristalse, similar to how the intestines do. So even if I spent all day walking around on my hands, urine would still move from my kidneys down into my bladder because of these smooth muscle contractions and peristalsis of the ureters. So every single time Peter's ureter tries to peristalse and squeeze that stone down, it's really going to hurt. And the stones that can form in the kidneys often are like these little spiculated things, right? It's not like a nice round little smooth pebble. It's like a little spiky thing. So as you can imagine, that would be really painful. It can also be problematic if it completely obstructs the ureter. So if it totally blocks the ureter, that kidney is going to keep making urine for a while because that's the kidney's main job. And that urine will build up and start to put pressure on the kidney, and that can cause damage to the kidney if it's completely obstructed. Luckily, most of the time, eventually, with peristalsis and drinking lots of fluid, which makes you make lots of urine to try to wash it down, luckily, most of the time, these stones will pass. It's very unpleasant, however, right? And sometimes there will be some blood in the urine as well. Sometimes they don't pass on their own, and so urologists will do some pretty crazy things, including something called shock wave lithotripsy, where they basically use sound waves to break up the stone into smaller pieces. It's pretty crazy. They try not to have to go in and do surgery. All right, so that's a kidney stone. Let's talk about Bonnie. So she is feeling really uncomfortable over the last day or so. She's noticed that she feels like she has to pee like every 10 to 15 minutes. She feels like she has to pee. Not only does she feel like she has to pee, but she feels like she has to go like right away, right? It can't wait. I have to go. It's an emergency. And it hurts, right? It's like peeing glass. It's a burning pain when she urinates. So she goes to the health center, right? And we find out, you have a bladder infection, sometimes called a urinary tract infection, or UTI. So let's take a look at that. Right? So what's your bladder anyway? It's basically a muscular bag that stores urine, right? So luckily we don't have to constantly drip urine out all the time, right? We store it up until we have a significant volume of it in the bladder. And then the wall of the bladder has smooth muscle in it that then will contract and empty the bladder. Luckily, right, we have a sphincter muscle down here that is skeletal muscle. So when you feel like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom, that's the smooth muscle of your bladder contracting and saying, we would like to empty, please. And starting around age 2 or 3, we get control over that sphincter muscle, that skeletal muscle. So we can say, not right now. Why don't you wait till I go to the bathroom? Right? So that allows us to control when we actually void or urinate. So this is what that process looks like when we do go to the bathroom. So it's called voiding or micturition, if you ever see that word. And the bladder will push down, the smooth muscle will contract, and it will squeeze and push the bladder out if you relax the sphincter muscle here. Right? So that's the part that's under voluntary control. So what's going on with poor Bonnie and why is she having these symptoms, right? So normally the job of the bladder is to fill with urine, right? And hold it for a while until we have a decent volume. Well, if you have an infection in your bladder, the inside of the bladder is all irritated and raw and kind of angry. So what they're trying to show you here is all this little irritation. And so what happens then is your bladder is kind of twitchy, right? So it just wants to keep contracting. It's just like, it doesn't want to have to fill with urine. It's irritated, it's infected, it's unhappy. It doesn't want to do its job, right? So it doesn't want to hold any urine, so you feel like you have to go to pee all the time, right? And then it can hurt when it does contract. So what do we do for urinary tract infections? So there's a lot of this, like, oh, you should drink cranberry juice. Unfortunately, cranberry juice doesn't treat urinary tract infections. We actually have some really good data that shows that taking cranberry supplements on a regular basis can help prevent them. But once you have a UTI, cranberry doesn't help. So if you're like, oh, good, because I don't like cranberry juice anyway, right? So that's fine. Can drinking a lot of water help? Sure, right? Because that can help flush out the bladder, basically kind of wash it out, try to flush out the infection that's there. The problem is most of the time, once an infection has been established in the bladder, we're really going to need some antibiotics to treat it, okay? Bacteria are in a place where they don't belong. So antibiotics that kill the bacteria are the #1 mainstay of treatment for this. right? There are medicines like azo that you can buy at the pharmacy, and what they do is they numb your bladder. They don't do anything to the bacteria, they just make it feel better. It's like if you have strep throat and you do the chloroseptic spray or a throat lozenge, right? It doesn't treat the bacterial infection, it just makes the symptoms better. That's what azo is, it just numbs your bladder. So that doesn't actually treat the infection. And cranberries, I mentioned, doesn't help treat them, but can help prevent them. And drinking lots of fluids can be helpful. All right. These are very, very common in female-bodied people, and it has to do with their urethras. So let's talk about that. So urethra says, why do bladder infections happen so much more frequently in female-bodied people than male-bodied people? And the answer is it's all about the urethra. So this is a male-bodied person kind of looking at us diagonally. So here's the penis here and the scrotum. This is the urinary bladder, the two ureters. And the urethra has to travel through the pelvis and then down out through the entire length of the penis. So in male-bodied people, the urethra is about 20 centimeters long. Right? It's really long. In female-bodied people, so this is a front view, so slightly different view. But again, here's our ureters, here's the bladder, and then the urethra is only about this long. So it's really short. It's only about 4 centimeters long. So what that means is it's much easier for bacteria that normally live on the surface of our skin, especially in the region of our anus and all kinds of places, right? It's much easier for bacteria to go whoop and get in here where it's like paradise and they just throw a party, okay? Bacteria in a male-bodied person have to like schlep all the way up here and hope to get all the way up there before he goes pee and washes them out and before the immune system detects that they're there, right? So although urinary tract infections and bladder infections do happen sometimes in male-bodied people, they are far, far less common. Right? This is a side view of a female-bodied person, just so you can see. Here's the bladder, urinary bladder, and the urethra. Here's the vagina right behind it, and the uterus. And here's the rectum and the anus. Right? And they're not that far away from each other. Okay? So looking at the external genitalia again, here's the opening of the urethra in males. Got to go all the way through the penis and up into the pelvis to get to the bladder. But in females, here's the opening of the urethra here. So we're looking at the external female genitalia. Labia majora is the normal hair-bearing skin out here. Labia minora. And then if you open those, you can see between them the urethral opening, which is really tiny and sometimes very difficult to see visually. So if you go home, you look with a mirror, it can be really hard to see. And then the vaginal opening is right below it. And there are bacteria in the vagina normally. And right down here is the anus. And there's a lot of bacteria on the skin here normally. So it's really easy for bacteria to enter the female urethra and very quickly get up into the bladder. So if the infection is just in the urethra, we call it a urethritis. If it gets up into the bladder, we'd call it a bladder infection or a cystitis or a UTI. But sometimes, especially if somebody doesn't take antibiotics, they just try to wait and see if it'll go away on its own, which sometimes they can, but often they can't. The bacterial infection can ascend up the ureters and get to the kidneys. So the fancy name for that is pyelonephritis. But you can get a kidney infection. And with a kidney infection, now that's much deeper in your body and you can get pretty sick. In fact, about 10% of people who get a kidney infection end up needing to be in the hospital. So you get fever, nausea, you might have some pain in the back there where the kidneys are located, right? So that's why we want to take bladder infections, even though they're so common, we take them pretty seriously because we want to avoid the infection tracking all the way up inside to the kidneys. All right. What about Yuri? So Yuri's a playa. Yuri's been having a lot of unprotected sex, and now he has pus dripping out the end of his penis, and it really burns when he pees. So this is urethritis in a male-bodied person, and is an inflammation and infection of the urethra itself, and is most commonly, although not exclusively, most commonly due to sexually transmitted infections like chlamydia. Chlamydia is the most common one that we see here on campus. And the tricky thing about chlamydia is it doesn't always cause symptoms. So some people get symptoms with it and some people don't. It's a very tricky little bacterium, and that's why it's so good at spreading. All right. Questions about this much? Yeah. What causes kidney stones? That's a really good question. So, did you ever do one of those experiments as a kid where you like made a solution, maybe with sugar or something else, and then you waited and it turned into crystals? You ever do one of those crystal growing things? So, in general, what happens is if you create a really super saturated solution, so if you dissolve a ton of solute in something, it's too much for it to be dissolved in there. And so it will start to precipitate out, right? So if you've ever had maple syrup in a glass jar, and like you've had the same bottle of maple syrup for like, I don't know, a year or something, and you'll see these little crystals of sugar form along the bottom of the bottle, you guys are like, no, I get Aunt Jemima, I really don't know, right? So if you have a super saturated solution, the solute will precipitate out and form crystals. So kidney stones, most kidney stones, not all of them, most of them are due to excess calcium in the urine, and it precipitates out. Yeah, I know, because you're like, oh, I don't want one of those. Right? So it's a good reason to stay hydrated. And there's some like familial conditions where people end up getting kidney stones because their kidneys are a little wonky and how they handle some of those solutes. Good question. Other questions?
What about the difference between a UTI and an STI?
The difference between a UTI and an STI, right? So some of the symptoms can be similar, right? That urethritis, that inflammation, irritation, infection in the urethra, right? STIs absolutely cause that, and so do bladder infections. The interesting thing about STIs is for the most part, they don't go up into the bladder. It is not their preferred hangout, so they usually don't go up into the bladder. So they usually just cause urethritis. And they are caused by bacteria or viruses in the case of STDs in general, but the ones that cause urethritis are bacteria. And they are only transmitted from one person to another during intimate genital-to-genital contact, as opposed to a UTI, which is generally caused by what we call just bad luck bacteria. These are bacteria that are normally present on the surface of the skin, and they just happen to have gotten into a place where they can overgrow and cause a problem. Yeah. So bladder infections are not usually STIs. It's usually just bacteria that was normally present that got into a place where it doesn't belong. Other questions? All right, those were good ones. All right, let's do a Kahoot and see how well you got that much. Okay, so the kidney is going to make urine as part of its process for getting rid of wastes. So what actually is in urine? So what do you think? What is in pee? What is in urine? Glucose? Hopefully not, right? We do not want to get rid of glucose. We invested a lot of effort to absorb that glucose from the inside of our intestines into our bloodstream. We do not want to let any of our nutrients escape the body and exit via urine. Yeah, Damon. Water. So there's a lot of water, right? It's very watery, right? It's a water-based solution. So we've got water. What else? Urea. Absolutely. You're like, what is urea? Urea is a breakdown product from when we break down proteins. Right? So urea, sometimes called a nitrogenous waste, because it's a waste molecule that has nitrogen in it. Other ideas, what else is there? Amino acids, those are nutrients. So hopefully, no. If our kidneys are working properly, there will be no amino acids in our urine. Damon? Salt. Yeah, absolutely, right? Like I said, if you've been eating a lot of sodium, you have more than your body needs. We don't store that anywhere. We pee it out. Okay? What else? Water, salts, urea. What's that distinctive aroma if urine's been sitting around for a while? Ammonia. Right? So ammonia is going to be in urine, and that is another nitrogenous waste. That's another waste product that contains nitrogen. Creatinine is another waste product that we're going to find in urine. And so it's basically all the stuff that our kidneys decided doesn't need or want that's in our bloodstream, right? So it's going to be water-based, and then we're going to have waste. So urea and uric acid is a breakdown product from nucleic acids, ammonia, which is another breakdown product from proteins, and creatinine. Does anybody know what creatinine might be a waste product from the breakdown of? It's giving you a big hint in its name. Absolutely, creatine. Or creatine, however you want to pronounce it, right? Which a lot of people take as a supplement to improve their performance for their workout, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the musculoskeletal system. So creatine is a really important molecule that's present in our muscles, and when we break it down, because it's worn out and we need to get rid of it, we turn it into creatinine. So these are the main wastes. There are others, but these are the main things. Also water. So we're going to let go of or hold on to more or less water depending on whether we need it or not. If I drink a whole liter of water over the next hour, I'm going to put a lot of water, into my urine because I don't need it. I mean, unless I happen to have been really dehydrated. Okay? And at night, when you're not drinking anything, right, no water is coming in, your kidneys hold on to water. And so in the morning when you wake up and you go pee, usually the urine is pretty dark in color because it has very little water in it, or relatively little water in it. So it looks more concentrated. It looks like a darker yellow. Right? So I'm going to get rid of more or less water depending on what's going on with my overall body homeostasis. There comes that word again. In terms of overall water levels, and also in terms of what's going on with my blood pressure. So if I have kind of low blood pressure and I want to tank up the system a little bit, I'll try to hold on to some extra water. The kidney is also really important in regulating pH. And it's going to do so by getting rid of hydrogen ions. Remember, hydrogen ions are acidic. That's kind of the definition of an acid, is that it has a lot of hydrogen ions. And hydrogen ions, you might recall, cause molecular mayhem. Right? They get in there and steal electrons. So if we need to get rid of extra acid, we're going to do it through our kidneys. Now we have another way to get rid of extra acid that we learned about a couple weeks ago. And we saw the video of the young boy who had some acidosis and what was true about his breathing. You're like, I do not remember, that was 2 weeks ago. So it was a little boy who had what's called diabetic ketoacidosis. His blood was too acidic, so he was breathing really quickly and deeply. Because my mask fits really well. Did you see that? Okay. But so he was getting rid of extra carbon dioxide to help get rid of extra acid. Okay. So our respiratory system helps us with pH homeostasis. But our kidneys, our urinary system, is going to help us also. It's just a bit of a slower process, but more long-term. So we have a rapid response with our respiratory rate, and we have a slower, more long-term response with what our kidneys are doing. Finally, we're going to have salts or electrolytes, depending on what our total body situation is for those, right? Depending on what you just ate, depending on what's going on, okay? So, if you were to taste urine, which I do not recommend, but that's what they did in ye olden days. I'm glad to be a physician now where we have little dipstick tests for urine. I don't have to taste it, right? Normally there should not be any glucose in there. It should not taste sweet. And there should not be any amino acids. All right. So how do the kidneys do this? It's so weird. Okay, so this process of doing this is kind of complicated, and there's 4 steps. And so the metaphor that we're going to use to kind of think of this is like cleaning out your closet in kind of a weird way. So I've got a box of a bunch of dry erase markers here. So let's say I wanted to reorganize my box of dry erase markers. Right? I wanted to get rid of the stuff in there that I don't want and keep the stuff that I do want. So that's basically what the kidneys are going to do with the blood. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a bunch of markers out. I'm not going to be picky. I'm just going to take a bunch of markers out, right? And then I'm going to be like, oh darn, I really love that pink one. And I'm going to put it back. And then I'm going to be like, oh, but that green one that's still in there, I don't want that. And I'm going to take it out. Okay? And then at the end, this is where my closet analogy does not translate to the marker box analogy. I'm going to adjust the hanger situation. Right? The analogy for the hangers is water. So we'll get back to that. So I have 4 steps. One is I just take a bunch of stuff out. The second is I move some of it back in. The third is I move some of the stuff that was in to out. And the fourth is then I'm going to balance the water. So how does this work? All right. We give these 4 steps fancy names. So step 1 is filtration. I'm going to passively filter some stuff out of the blood. We're going to talk about these one at a time. Step 2 is reabsorption. I'm going to reabsorb some things back into the blood. Say, oh, wait, I don't want to get rid of that. I'm going to take it back into the blood. So step 2 is reabsorption. Step 3 is secretion. I'm going to secrete things that were still left in the blood, but I'm like, I don't want you. I'm going to secrete those out of the blood into the urine. And then step 4 is I'm going to adjust the water. So step 4 is water balance. We're going to talk about the first 2 of these steps today. All right. The active functional unit of the kidney that does these 4 things is called the nephron. This is what's going to get her done. This is the part of the kidney that's going to do these 4 jobs for us. Okay? It's going to do these 4 jobs. They're microscopic. There's over 1 million of them per kidney. They're teeny, teeny, teeny little things. And they look hella confusing and really complicated. But they're actually not that bad. So the important thing I want you to remember about the nephron is that really we have 2 parallel tracts, 2 tubes moving in parallel throughout the whole nephron. One of them is for the blood. And the other one of them is for what's going to be the urine. And in the beginning, we're going to call that the filtrate. So filtrate is kind of the baby urine, right? When it's not kind of done being processed yet. The blood is going to move through blood vessels, no surprise there. There's going to be some arterioles and some capillaries and then eventually some veins. The urine, or the filtrate, is going to move through tubes called tubules. It just means little tubes. Okay? And so these are going to go side by side with each other so that you can move things back and forth from the blood to the urine and from the urine to the blood. So it's like if I had a second box here, right, that traveled with me, and I could move things over here and then I could move them back in here. So the nephron looks really complicated, but it's really just these 2 tracts traveling next to each other. And then you just curl it all up. The renal cortex, which is that outer portion of the kidney, is where we're going to find the top part of the nephron here that has this really interesting structure. And then the renal medulla, where we have those pyramids, is where we're going to find these long tubules, really long tubules and ducts. This is the whole thing. So I'm going to walk you through how the blood flows first. So here's my renal artery. Blood is coming to the kidney, travels out towards the cortex. It's going to travel through what's called an afferent arterioles. Remember, arterioles are small arteries. This one is called the afferent because it has affection toward. It is moving toward the nephron. It is then going to enter the glomerulus. This is a little ball of capillaries. It's a specialized ball of capillaries. It's called the glomerulus. And so the blood is going to travel through the glomerulus. And then after that ball of capillaries, after the glomerulus, the blood leaves through the efferent arteriole. E for exit. Okay. Then the blood will move into these capillaries that surround all of the tubules as we continue to do adjustments, do those 4 jobs that we talked about. And then once the blood has been fully processed, it drains into a venule and the renal vein and then the inferior vena cava and back to the heart. So that's what the blood flow is, the path of the blood flow is in the nephron. Now for the filtrate doesn't exist until we first start to take stuff out of the blood. And that process happens at the glomerulus. So we have this kind of like cup that surrounds the glomerulus called Bowman's capsule. So stuff is going to move out of the blood into Bowman's capsule. That's going to be our filtrate. Then it moves into what's called the proximal convoluted tubule, which is a fancy way of saying nearby squiggly little tube. And then it's going to move down this big loop, and then it's going to come into the distal convoluted tubule, which means farther away, squiggly little tube, and then eventually into a collecting duct, and this is going to drain into the renal pelvis, because by the time it gets here, it's the urine. No, it's like the most boring thing ever, but stay with me, okay? All right. So this is just all of that in text. So if you go back later, right, you can work it through. So I just want to show you again kind of the glomerulus, right? So blood comes in through the afferent arteriole into this ball of capillaries called the glomerulus, and some stuff is going to squeeze out of the blood. That's our baby filtrate. Enters into Bowman's capsule and then into the tubules. And that's all that information. So let's get into those 4 jobs in more detail. All right, that's just the 4 jobs. We're going to talk about filtration. That's the first one. And we're going to do it in a case-based way. So this is Glenda. And Glenda was feeling fine until all of a sudden she noticed that when she went pee, her urine had a really strange color. Almost looked like iced tea, right? That's not normal, okay? I know people are like, oh, yeah, that's not normal. She also noticed that she was getting swelling in her ankles. This actually happened to a patient of mine a couple years ago. And so I think you can see here the lines from the socks where they've made these huge dents because the ankles are so swollen. There's all this extra fluid in them, right? If you've ever had a sprained ankle, you know what that's like, all right? But she didn't sprain her ankle. She didn't injure. And actually, when the patient, her name wasn't Glenda, but when she came to me, she thought it was because she had been, she worked for the campus garden that we had. And she was spending a lot of time out kind of squatting in the garden weeding and stuff, and she thought maybe that was why she was having the swelling in her ankles, and she thought maybe she was dehydrated from being out in the warm weather and working hard all day, and maybe that was why her urine was such a strange color. but she was incorrect as to the cause of her problems. So this is a problem with filtration, which is job number 1. Filtration happens in the glomerulus. I'm going to say that again. Filtration occurs in the glomerulus. Maybe a third time for a charm. Filtration happens in the glomerulus. And it is that process by which small molecules will actually get squeezed out of the glomerular capillary into Bowman's capsule. And so the thing about this filtration is it's completely passive. It's a completely passive process, and it's based on size. So if you think about how a coffee filter works, or especially a pour-over coffee, right? When we make coffee, you've got coffee grounds that are relatively large, and you've got water, which is made up of small water molecules. Now, there are additional coffee molecules that dissolve into the water, right, that are small enough to pass through the filter. So the same thing is happening in the glomerulus. If a molecule is small enough to pass through the wall of the capillary, it will do so. So what we see is from the blood in the capillaries, small molecules like water, amino acids, glucose, sodium, and other salts, wastes like urea, creatinine, urea that we talked about, they're going to move through the capillary wall into the filtrate in Bowman's capsule. So this is purely a size-based thing. If you're small enough to squeeze through the little holes, you go through the little holes, and you end up in Bowman's capsule as the filtrate. If you're big, however, you can't fit through the little openings in these special glomerular capillaries, and so you're going to stay inside the bloodstream. You're going to stay inside the blood vessels. And so in general, the things that are normally too big to go through are your blood cells, so your erythrocytes, your leukocytes, even your platelets, as well as proteins that we find in the bloodstream, in the plasma. So they're often called plasma proteins. Important proteins that help us regulate our body fluid, as well as lots of other things. So some of the water, amino acids, glucose, sodium waste, and other small things will fall through and go into the filtrate. Some won't have enough time to go through. They'll just continue on. And they'll partly continue on too because this is passive. Mother Nature likes equal concentrations on both sides, right? So not all of it's going to go over here because that would require active transport to have all of the solute on one side and none of it on the other. So about half of those small things are going to move into the filtrate. The other half is going to continue on in the blood, including those wastes. So we're going to have to deal with that later. So this is filtration. It's totally based on size and it's passive. And it's happening in the glomerulus. So here's just kind of, you can see the bigger things stay in the bloodstream, smaller things will move through into the filtrate, but some of them will also head out. So what happened with Glenda? So she had inflammation of her glomeruli. She had something called glomerulonephritis. In her case, it was due to lupus, which caused inflammation of this part of her kidneys. And if the glomeruli, those little capillaries, get really inflamed, they get leaky. And what happens if they get leaky is then some of those big things end up slipping out into the filtrate. So in her case, the plasma proteins were coming out into the filtrate, and some of the blood cells were coming out into the filtrate. And when you have blood in the kidney that gets into the urine up high like that, it ends up coming out the other end looking kind of like iced tea colored instead of red. If it's lower bleeding, it looks red. But if it's high up in the kidneys, right? Oh, so I should have asked you all those questions, but I didn't. I just told you. Sorry. All right. So her glomerular capillaries were too leaky, so things leaked out. The blood cells turned the urine reddish, and not having the plasma proteins meant her body couldn't control fluid normally. And so she had fluid leaking out into the tissue in her ankles, and that's what caused the swelling. Yeah?
Break your ankle. What is the fluid
So what happens when you sprain your ankle and you get swelling? So that's a really good question. So the fluid in both of these situations, the fluid that's causing that swelling is plasma, which you remember is the liquid component of blood. So water with dissolved solutes and all those things, okay? Now, it's different when you sprain your ankle. When you sprain your ankle, the blood vessels get leaky because of an inflammatory response. So it's part of our body's normal healing response to make the capillaries leaky when we have an area of injury, to make it easier for immune cells and cells that are going to do repair and healing to get to that location. So anytime you have an injury and you get swelling there, because the capillaries are leaky as a result of our normal way of trying to get all the helper cells to that area. Now, swelling is not always your friend, however, right? You have a lot of fluid leaking out into the tissues. It causes pressure, and then it can actually decrease the amount of blood flow you can get into that area, which is why if you do have an injury, we want you to elevate it, right, to keep that swelling down. Swelling causes pain, and it can impair the healing process. Good question. Other questions? All right. Yeah. The difference between rolling your ankle and spraining your ankle. I think it's just semantics, meaning just a choice of words, but perhaps the degree of the injury. Technically, kind of the same thing, just maybe milder than a sprain. We'll talk about sprains when we do musculoskeletal. That'd be a good idea. All right. All right. We're going to talk about job number 2, and we're going to use Reba as an example. So job number 2, you might remember, is reabsorption. So Reba has diabetes, and so there's a couple of different types of diabetes, but in both of them, what happens is your blood glucose levels are too high. You might think, why would that be a problem? There's just more food for your cells. Well, it causes problems for a lot of reasons. But what she finds, so she tests her urine, she doesn't taste it, she uses one of the dipsticks, and she finds that there's glucose in her urine. And she remembers that I said you should not ever normally have glucose in your urine, right? So the question is, okay, why is this happening, right? The body should not normally pee out nutrients. We worked really hard with our whole digestive system to get those things absorbed into our bloodstream, so it is not normal ever to pee out glucose. So it has to do with job number 2, which is reabsorption. So remember, some of the things that I took out of my closet, some of the things that moved out during filtration are things I don't want to get rid of. So I want to pull them back. And so glucose, absolutely. I don't want a single molecule of glucose to escape if I can help it. Amino acids, which are my building blocks of proteins, they were small enough to move across in the filtrate. I don't want to lose those either. Those are my nutrients, right? And then depending on the situation, maybe sodium too. Okay? So they went through during filtration into Bowman's capsule and the filtrate, and I need to pull them back into my capillary. I need to pull them back into my bloodstream. And in the case of glucose and amino acids, I want all of it back, right? So I want all of the glucose and all of the amino acids to be in my bloodstream and none of it to be in the filtrate. So am I going to be moving it against its concentration gradient or with its concentration gradient? Absolutely against, okay? So this is going to be active transport. I'm going to need ATP for this. It's going to take work to do this. And in order to do that work and use that ATP to accomplish this, I need special protein carriers. So these cells around these tubules are going to have lots of mitochondria in them to make ATP. And they're going to have special protein carriers who can use that ATP to grab that glucose and haul it back in. Grab those amino acids and haul it back into your bloodstream so that you don't pee it out. And that's reabsorption. So this is just that information, okay? So you need these carrier proteins. And the trick and the problem with REBA ends up being that you only have so many of these carrier proteins. And so if there's a ton of glucose in the blood, there ends up being a ton of glucose in the filtrate. More glucose than you have carrier proteins to grab and pull back. So what happens in people with diabetes, if their blood glucose levels are too high, they overwhelm the ability of those protein carriers to reabsorb that glucose back into the bloodstream. And so it ends up getting lost in the urine, which is a big problem, right? You don't want to be losing a nutrient. Okay, and this is the explanation for that. And it's why a lot of times with people with poorly controlled diabetes will lose weight because they're peeing out their glucose, right? They're peeing out their nutrient and energy source. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, I'm going to share with you. All right, so there's the link if you want to share it with anybody. All right.